Yes, welcome to our talk. The name is Rage Against the Machine Clear, systematic analysis of machine clears and their implication for transient execution attacks. This was a paper made by me and my colleague Hany and Ragab, together with our professor Herbert and Cristiano, and we are coming from the VUSEC security group in Amsterdam. The talk will be split in this way. We start with a small background section, and then we go to the main core of the presentation, that is the machine clears indeed. And also, I know you like this stuff, we're going to show you a full end-to-end exploit on Firefox based on our work. And finally, we conclude on some results. Okay, let's break the ice. How many of you knows this image? Maybe, okay, I see 1, 2, 3, okay, good. So this is a perfect example of side channel. Basically, the Dutch police managed to discover people growing weed in their apartment just by observing the melted snow on the roof due to the high temperature of growing the plants. So the police, just by passing there, they managed to understand something that is not visible, but yet, thanks to a side effect of the action, you can still discover what's happening behind, let's say, a wall. But today we're talking about computers, not about growing weed, sorry. So how does correlate with processors? Well, that was a thermal side channel. With CPU, it's much better to talk about timing side channel. And the most famous one is flash and reload. It's quite simple in the end. Imagine you have two processes, attacker and victim. And we have the data cache in the bottom that is a shared resource on the processor. It's a physical resource. The first step is to remove from the cache every cache line in the cache indeed. And then we wait for the victim to execute some secret code. And let's say that depending on a secret B of a cryptographic key, for example, the victim is either accessing entry 0 or 1 of the array. And let's say, for example, the entry 1 was accessed. This means that the processor will bring into the cache array 1, and later the attacker, using the reload step, it can measure the access time of every array entry. And the first one will be slow because the data is not there, so it will take a lot of time to read this value, while reading array at 1 will be much faster because the data is already in the cache, and the load time will be much faster, and this timing difference is measurable on the processor. So again, just by a side effect of caching or not caching something, an attacker can observe a timing difference in a load operation. Things get very interesting when combining this timing side channel with speculative execution. That is also called transient execution. So again, processor to optimize performance as much as possible, it will speculate on the instruction that will be executed later. So for example, this is a very normal snippet of code. We have a bounded array access, and we are verifying that the load operation is in the bound size of the array. Let's say that, for example, the array size is not readily available, is coming from a long load operation. The processor will not wait to wait this load to know what to do next. It will speculate and execute the inner body of the if condition, even if maybe this is a wrong execution path. So let's say it will speculate, execute the body of the branch, and as we saw earlier, we are also caching some entry due to this load of the array X. But let's say again that this prediction was wrong. The processor must revert everything and then take the other branch path. However, this entry is still present in the cache, even if the instruction never retired or was never committed, so the attacker can observe what the processor did on the wrong path. And here, many attacks can be generated, as you can see. This is just the most famous attack of the last years, from 2017, basically. Probably you know about Spectre and Meltdown, that was quite famous back in the days. Later, there was this big class named microarchitecturally data sampling. It is basically leaking from many other buffers in the processor. We also have, for example, low-level injection. Later also, we had crosstalk. We are not only leaking in the same core, but from other adjacent cores. So we are removing this bound. And now, today, we are presenting our latest work. It is a new category of this kind of attack that is machine clear. And here we managed to build two attack primitives confirmed by major vendors that are floating point value injection and speculative code store bypass. Now we'll give to Hany the stage.
All right. So Intel defines the bad speculation or the main cause of discarding issued microoperations on x86 processors. So whenever we not commit some sort of microoperations on x86 processors, this is a bad speculation, and it can be caused by many different root causes. And they're classified by Intel into two main classes. The first one is branch misprediction, where we have a branch predictor that mispredicts either the target or the direction of our branch, as we saw earlier. And the second one is called machine clear, where we have a condition that deterministically will flush the entire pipeline and restart the execution from the last retired instruction. And this is what we're going to present today. So again, branch misprediction have been widely used along with different types of faults and Intel TSX abortions in all the main transit execution attacks that have been widely discovered in the recent years. But the same cannot be said about the class of machine clear that remains until our work widely unexplored, and this is what we are going to do today. So in this work, we performed the reverse engineering and the security analysis of the four main types of machine clear, which are self-modifying code, floating point, memory ordering, and memory disambiguation machine clear. Two of these four types led us to discover two brand new transit execution-based attack primitives. First one is called Speculative Code Store Bypass, and the second one is called floating point value injection. Furthermore, floating point value injection led us to mount an end-to-end exploit leaking arbitrary memory addresses inside the latest Firefox web browser that millions of users are using. And this attack can reach a leakage rate that can be up to 13 kilobytes per second. So in order to perform the reverse engineering of these types of machine clear, we first try to understand what is the architectural invariant behind each type of machine clear. Second, how this invariant can be violated and therefore triggering machine clear, flushing the entire pipeline. Third, how this invariant violation, what is the security implication of this violation? And lastly, how this violation can be exploited, leaking to a leakage of secret information. So the first type of machine clear representing today is called self-modifying code machine clear. And it's based on the concept of self-modifying code, which is a program storing instructions as data, modifying its own code as it's being executed. Self-modifying code have been widely used in malwares trying to unpack themselves in the right moment. This is one of the most famous use cases. But here we'll see it in a totally different way that it's being used. Let's take the snippet of code where we have two instructions. We have a store and a load. The store is trying to modify the load, changing it from a load secret to a no operation. Modern front ends of modern x86 processors try to speculatively fetch the code and execute to maximize the execution throughput. They're not going to wait until the architectural information is ready, so they try to do this in a totally speculative manner. And when the front end encounters a self-modifying code, the store at some point will have to modify the following instruction, and will do this by modifying and targeting the already residing instruction in the instruction cache. But by the time that this is actually detected, the CPU have already fetched, decoded, and executed the load secret speculatively. And by the time it actually detects that there was a store trying to modify this already fetched, decoded, and executed instruction, this have already left an observable microarchitectural trace, as we saw earlier, that an attacker can observe. So this detection of a self-modifying code is not immediate, and it leaves some time for instruction to be executed speculatively, leaving an observable microarchitectural trace. So the architectural invariant here of a self-modifying code is that store instructions always target data addresses. This invariant is violated in the case of a self-modifying code, which targets code addresses instead. This allows an attacker to transiently execute stale code, which in this case, the load secret. This load secret will never be committed because the committed instruction is the no operation, not the load secret. The load secret have been executed speculatively, leaving an observable microarchitectural trace. And in order to understand how this can be exploited, we have to understand what is the attack primitive that the self-modifying code is actually giving us. So the attack primitive that we mounted on top of self-modifying code machine clear is called Speculative Code Store Bypass. And its main use case is an environment where an attacker can perform the two main steps of our self-modifying code, which are writing code and executing it. One of the most famous attack scenarios in this case are JIT engines, where an attacker can control code is manipulated and it can be executed when the attacker wants, basically. So in this case, we have a function f that the attacker is trying to write to perform the first step of self-modifying code, and then will later try to execute it. But before getting into the three main steps of our attack primitive, keep in mind that code and data are two views of the same exact memory, and they're always kept coherent between each other. So in the first step of our attack primitive, as we said, the attacker will try to write the code of a function f where the code of a function g is already residing. And again, this is done on the data view. We're writing code as data. Then this store instruction of the function f will temporarily desynchronize code view and data view. The code view will continue to contain the code of the function g. The data view will contain the new code that the attacker just wrote. And now, if the attacker tries to execute and call the function that it just wrote, what will happen is that the CPU will fetch the code residing at the same address from the code view, which is temporarily desynchronized. So it will speculatively execute the code of function g instead. At some point, the CPU will detect there has been a self-modifying code desynchronizing code and data, and will issue a machine clear, flushing its pipeline from the code that has been speculatively executed, which is in this case function g. Eventually, the CPU will restore the coherence between code and data and will write the new code also in the code view and will take the architectural execution path of executing the new code that was meant to be executed in the first place. We tried to understand how Intel suggests to handle self-modifying code and cross-modifying code. And we observed that the first option that Intel is actually suggesting to do so is describing the exact steps that our attack primitive is actually doing. It's telling write code and execute it without no notion of this desynchronization that can actually happen in the background. So any program that is adopting option 1 to handle self-modifying code or cross-modifying code, they're actually performing a speculative code store bypass attack in the background without actually knowing about it. So how we can actually mitigate such an attack? What we need to do is that once we store a new code, this is already visible in the code view. So whenever we try to call it, we're calling the new code and not the stale one. And what we do is actually adopting option 2, which is suggesting to issuing a serializing instruction right after we store the new code. So what we do is write the new code, serialize, and make sure that the code view is containing the new code and not any stale code that was residing there. Interestingly, both Chrome and Firefox, the two main web browsers that millions of users are using, they do not do anything when they actually write new code because they are relying on option 1 that CPU vendors are suggesting, which is code and data are meant to be coherent all the time. Don't worry about it. Just write your new code and execute it. But based on what we discovered, we are actually performing a speculative code store bypass without knowing anything about it. So for exploitation of SMC, We have Speculative Code Store Bypass, which allows an attacker to transiently execute stale code, which is somehow similar to its architectural counterpart, which is a use after free attack primitive, which allows an attacker to dereference memory, which is no longer referenced anymore. Sorry. Okay, so this was one type of machine clear. The second type we're presenting is called memory ordering, and it's built on top of the total store order memory model, which guarantees that all CPU cores see all memory operations as the program order, except of one case. When we have a store instruction followed by a load instruction operating on different addresses, these two instructions may be reordered. Let's take a look at this example. We have processor A that is performing 2 load operations and then a function call on a dependent result. And we have processor B, which is performing 2 store operations on the same addresses that processor A is manipulating. So let's assume that for some reason, the first load of processor A is slow due to cache misses. The data at address X needs to be fetched from main memory. This takes time. So what processor A will do is, again, tries to maximize the execution throughput by not waiting for the data of address X to be fetched, and will execute out of order the second load on address Y and all subsequent dependent operations, and will keep them in a ready-to-commit state. So once the data at address X is fetched from memory, it will commit everything in program order following the total store order memory model. But let's assume that at this point, processor B executes its store operations. What will happen here is that processor A cannot commit what it actually executed out of order as is, because it would be the proof that it violated the memory model. So what it will do, it will flush its pipeline from the instructions executed out of order, take into account the new value stored by processor B, re-execute all the instructions that it actually flushed before, and commit, again, everything following the memory model. So here, the architecture invariant of this type of machine clear is out-of-order execution always complies with the total store order memory model. This invariant is violated in the case of a memory ordering machine clear, where we allow an attacker to transiently lake stale data by performing this type of operations. And to exploit this, we tried many times, but it's not trivial at all due to the strict synchronizations between processor B and processor A. You need to make sure that you actually write or perform these stores that would disrupt the memory model of processor A at a specific time. And this is not easy at all. Now I'll hand over to Enrico, who will tell you about the floating point machine clear.
Okay, thank you, Hany. Yes, so the floating point machine clear is based on a very strange representation of floating point numbers. It is called subnormal, that are numbered below this 2 to the power of minus 1022. But to keep it simple, a subnormal number is a very small floating point number. So, as usual, let's make an example to clarify the concept where this machine clear is coming from. Very common piece of code. We have a floating point division followed by a floating point addition, for example. And basically, the floating point unit is not capable to handle such strange number. The hardware must be fast, so it can only manage standard floating point numbers. So the hardware is specialized for normal floating point numbers. And whenever we have a subnormal number as a floating point operand, the processor is not capable to manage such number, and it will rely on software to compute the correct result. So again, let's look at the example. We perform a floating point division, and let's say that the result, one of the operands is a subnormal number. What happened is that the floating point unit gave to the processor, to the subsequent instruction, a wrong result, because again, the floating point unit is not capable of handling such numbers. So what happened is basically that the processor executed speculatively some instruction using wrong floating point numbers from the previous computation. So the processor is forced to flush to remove all the subsequent instructions that were based on a wrong floating point result. And now it needs to come back, recompute the results in software using a microcode assist, and then giving the result back. So as you can see, floating point machine clear is quite demanding because you need to recompute the mathematical operation over. Again, because the hardware is not really capable of handling such numbers. Here, the invariant is that the floating point unit always operate on these floating point numbers that are the hardware is capable of. And whenever there is a subnormal, we pay the price of waiting up more for the correct result. To violate this is super simple. You just need to make a mathematical operation using this subnormal number, these strange floating point numbers. And the security implication is that for a few instructions later, they are using a wrongly computed result. And for exploitation here, things get very interesting because we managed to build an end-to-end exploit running on Firefox. And this is our attack setup. On the left, you can see the victim page that has a different origin to the iframe on the right. Imagine the right part as an advertisement in a web page. And our goal is to leak the content of the victim page from a different iframe. So let's go back for a moment to the floating point numbers. We release a tool that you can find on GitHub, where basically you provide the wrongly computed result of the floating point operation. And this tool will give you two operands that will transiently generate the number that you want. So for example, if you want that beef as a wrongly computed result, this tool will give you the x and y operands of the division that will transiently generate that specific result. And here maybe you can see when you divide, for example, these two numbers, this minus 0.69 divided by 4.94, architecturally will be minus infinity. But again, since the processor cannot handle these results, speculatively the first result, the wrong one, will be this strange number here on the bottom with the dead beef value that we wanted to have. But now you can also see on the top, we have this FFFB. Why so? Because our victim is the JavaScript engine of Firefox, and there every object variable is representing using a floating point number. Strange, yes, but actually they did a very nice trick. They used the upper bits that are unused for non-numbers, and the upper bits is simply the type of the variable. So for example, FFB, it means that the variable will be of type string, while the bottom bits, the deadbeef000, is the pointer to the string, okay? So if in JavaScript we perform a division between these two numbers, and then we ask the JavaScript engine, look, what is the type of this floating point division? Of course, you will tell me is a floating point numbers, right? You should not take the red branch. Indeed, architecturally will take the blue branch. However, for a short amount of time, with the wrongly computed result, the JavaScript engine will believe that the floating point division will be a string, and we control the string pointer, because again, the beef value was chosen by us, and now it's basically game over. We can simply ask, for example, the length parameter of the string, and we are literally reading the address that we want in memory, and then with a simple flush and reload cover channel, we can observe the leaked memory entirely. So again, to simplify here, from a single floating point division, we can mount a load primitive. We can read any memory address in memory, just because the hardware is not capable of handling such numbers. The last step, that is also quite powerful to show the attack, that when we perform this load, we cannot crash the program because all this instruction is speculative, okay? The processor will discard everything. So this is super helpful for us to break SLR. We just, I don't know, allocate 1 gigabyte of known text, and then we start reading every memory address of the processor in a coarse-grained way. We find our spray memory, and then we do a small fine-grained search to find where the Firefox process is located in memory. Now, we have made a video, not a live demo because it's safer, but it should be still cool. So again, victim and iframe on the right. Here we are just starting spraying the memory again, to break the ASLR to find where Firefox is present. And here, please, again, we are just doing floating point division over and over with controlled parameters. But still, we can leak arbitrary memory address thanks to this unboxing representation. We can read arbitrary memory addresses. So as you can see here, it's just breaking SLR. It takes, 20, 30 seconds, exactly. And now we are already leaking the Firefox process memory. We're not printing anything, but we're just printing meaningful text to not clobber the output. And as you can see in a few seconds, exactly, now we are leaking the secret victim page from a different origin, only using floating point division. To think about it is pretty crazy in our opinion. Okay. And okay, the demo also broke the stage. Oh, great. And also the cool part, we are leaking also other JavaScript part in Firefox, who knows. We are leaking all the process memory, so pretty nice. To conclude on floating point, the leakage rate that we measured was 13 kilobytes per second, not bad. And we can mitigate this in different way, just by disabling these floating point numbers. Or we also implemented a compiler pass to serialize the pipeline of the processor when we detect these gadgets. Or as Firefox did, made a precise defense. Whenever now you're doing a floating point division in Firefox, Firefox is checking that the result is not of type none. Or simply Chrome was already safe because they were using site isolation. Last type of machine clear for today, that is memory disambiguation. So when a load instruction is following a store instruction and the destination are not yet known, there is a special predictor in the CPU that tries to predict if you can perform this operation out of order or not. Oh, well, if the addresses are aliasing, you need to execute them in order. Otherwise, out of order. Again, let's make an example to clarify. Again, very simple snippet of code, a store followed by a load operation. And let's say that the store operation, the target address of the store is not yet known. So the processor will not wait and would like to execute the subsequent load out of order. And for that, is asking the CPU, wait, these store and load addresses are the same, because if they are different, I can execute them out of order. Let's say that predictor will say, no, come on, you can go out of order. They are different addresses. Feel free to do that. And the processor will execute the load before the store is actually executed. But let's say that this prediction was wrong, so the store and the load address were actually the same. The processor must flush the pipeline and re-execute again, executing the store and the load in program order. Here, the invariant is that the predictor never makes a mistake, and obviously it can. And to violate that, you need to massage the predictor to make this misprediction happening. And here the implication is simply that the speculative executed load took some stale data, so the attacker can execute some stale data from previous execution. And this was already a known attack, was named Spectre v4. But here we want to show it as a machine clear because it's a data mispeculation rather than a control flow mispeculation. But Hany will talk about that later. 4 already a lot, I know, but in our paper there are even more if you want a bit more pain. And you can find them. There are some interesting ones like exception or some strange masked load instruction of Intel. Feel free to read our paper for more information. And now back for some results.
All right, so now that we've seen 4 types of machine clear, let's zoom out a bit and look at the big picture. So we've seen self-modifying code that is affecting not only JIT engines, but is affecting browsers, operating systems, hypervisors, or any software writing code and executing it without first serializing the execution. Then we saw memory ordering machine clear, where one processor violates the memory ordering model of the other processor, allowing still data to be leaked. And then floating point, where we have the control of injecting a specific wrong result in subsequent operations, and this can let us, an attacker, to, in this case, leak arbitrary memory. And then finally, memory disambiguation, where we can train a different predictor to mispredict in disambiguating two addresses, allowing an attacker to, again, leak stale memory. We try to evaluate these types of machine clear compared to all previous known ways of creating transit execution paths, and here are the results. On the x-axis, we have the different ways of creating this transit execution path, which means executing instructions and then flushing them and then re-executing the architectural path. These are all different ways of creating this behavior. On the x-axis, we have all different behaviors, different mechanisms, sorry. And on the y-axis, we have two plots that are representing two properties. The top plot is the number of transient loads that can fit in one single window, one single transient window created by the corresponding transit execution mechanism. And the bottom plot shows what is the leakage rate of such a primitive. If I create, for example, a transient window with a fault, what is the leakage rate that I can get out of it? So here, the bars of flush and reload, these are the architectural upper limit of a leakage rate. This is an architectural leakage, so nothing can get beyond this, because this is a committed leakage. So these instructions will be committed at the end, rather than all the other mechanisms will never be committed, so they must have a lower leakage rate. Then we have Intel TSX, the BHD, and faults, which are the three main mechanisms that all previous transit execution attacks were relying on to create this behavior of executing instructions and reverting. These were only the three known ways of creating such behavior. And Intel TSX is only available only in Intel, and again, it's not available anymore due to all the attacks that actually abuse this mechanism. So an attacker would have been left with only two ways of creating such a behavior: BHT, so mispredicting a branch, like we saw in the beginning of this presentation, and then a fault, which would have crashed potentially the program. But in our work, we are presenting 5 different ways of creating such a behavior, and they're also available on AMD processors. One interesting result is how many transient loads can fit in one single window created by a self-modifying code machine clear. Here we measured more than 160 transient loads in a single window. These are loads that will never be committed, will never have an architectural result at the end that a program can observe. These can only be observed only on the microarchitectural level through some sort of cover channel, as we saw. So in a 160 loads, many things can fit, and many things can be executed in the background without even noticing. Another interesting result is the leakage rate of floating point machine clear, which can reach more than 4 megabits per second. And this is thanks to its determinism. Once you have an X and Y, you are deterministically creating a transient window that is super controlled under all the information that the attacker can decide. There is no branch predictor to train or mistrain. Here, X and Y, you have a transient window that you can create easily. We also tried to classify all these ways of creating transit execution attack to make it a bit more clear when we are looking at all these different root causes. So first, we start with control flow misprediction and data misprediction, which are the two subclasses, the two main subclasses under bad speculation, and which are representing a simple idea. Are we speculating on code, or are we speculating on data? Then we start reasoning on how we can speculate on code or data. It makes it easier this way to look at these different root causes. Each subclass has its own predictor subclass, which represents all the predictors that are speculating on code or data. While control flow mispredictions are failed attempts to predict the next instruction to execute, data mispredictions are failed attempts to operate on data that has not been validated yet. Then we have the exception subclass that belongs to data misprediction, where we have all the architectural exceptions that have been widely explored in previous attacks. Then we introduced in this work a subclass of data abstraction called likely invariance validations, where we have all the architecture invariants that usually hold but occasionally fail. Like, for example, in the case of a floating point, if we provide two floating point numbers that are normal numbers, nothing will happen, and this is the assumption, this is the invariant that a floating point unit works with. But if I provide a floating point number that is a denormal or subnormal number, things break, and then the invariant is violated. And finally, we have another subclass of latency prediction which represents the hardware interrupts that were yet another way of creating transient execution path that we observed during our reverse engineering. We disclosed floating point value injection and speculative code store bypass to all major CPU, browser, operating system, and hypervisor vendors earlier this year. And we confirmed that speculative code store bypass is affecting all Intel CPUs, all AMD CPUs, but is not affecting ARM CPUs. And in the case of ARM CPUs, they're not affected because of the explicit coherence between code and data is explicitly left to the programmer. You have to explicitly make sure that these two views contain the same information. When it comes to floating point value injection, again, all Intel CPUs are affected, all AMD CPUs are affected, and again, most of the ARM floating point implementations in our hardware, we were informed later after our disclosure that we were also affected by floating point value injection. Mozilla confirmed the vulnerability and deployed mitigation based on conditionally masking the malicious nembox transient result that we forward to the CPU, and the mitigation, the countermeasure is have been deployed from Firefox 87 and on. Lastly, the Zen hypervisor also mitigated SCSB and released a security advisory where they actually suggest to issue a serializing instruction after you write the new code to make sure that code and data views are coherent. To conclude, bad speculation is not caused only by classic branch mispredictions, as we knew up until to this work, but also by architectural invariant violations, like all the different types of machine clear that were presented today. These architectural invariants can be exploited, creating new security threats, like floating point value injection and speculative code store bypass. And we think that defenses must focus on the wider meaning of speculation. It's not only speculating over a branch, but the wider meaning of this as we showed in this work. You can find the paper, the code, and the reverse engineering code and the exploit on our websites. And yeah, you can ask us any questions or Twitter or here during the conference. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Enrico and Hany. Are there any questions for them?
How exactly did you stumble on this field of research? How does a paper like this start? What's the idea behind it?
It's very simple. By reading the Intel manual and finding something suspicious, you read some specification and you say, this there is something behind it, and yeah, mainly that. Yeah, you need to read a lot of documentation, hoping to find something to leak from. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So as a security researcher, you were just reading the documentations of various.
Okay. So again, up until this work, everyone thought that creating transient windows is by mispredicting a branch, but it seemed too naive as a conclusion. So there must have been another way that you can actually do this. And if you look also from another perspective of performance degradation, where do you actually lose clock cycles in the execution? And then you can backtrack what are the different causes of losing execution throughput, and then you can see all the different reasons, and one of them is actually the entire class of machine clear.
Okay, thank you.
No.
So thanks again, Enrico and Hany.